How do you do? This is Bob Leslie, WWJ-TV, and this is Profile. Profile of Mr. Jamison Handy, founder and president of the Jam Handy Organization of Detroit and of the world. An organization celebrating its 50th anniversary, and one which established in Detroit the first talking picture studio devoted to the making of educational and industrial motion pictures. Jam, for Jamison Handy, was born in Philadelphia in 1886. Since early youth, he has devoted himself to education, wholesome competitive sport, and supporting the tenets of spiritual faith, helping churches regardless of creed. Well, Mr. Handy, your pioneering in the field of visual education has won you countless citations from our armed services and our government for your help in 3 major wars. You've been cited as a star salesman on many occasions. Your Olympic prowess as a swimmer is well known and outstanding. But most recently, you must have derived much pleasure in this proclamation declaring last November 27th to be Jam Handy Day in Detroit, and I hold here a copy of it, signed by Mayor Louis Miriani.
It was embarrassing, but enjoyable.
Well, congratulations, sir. And I thought that instead of defining the whereases, this is what we'll try to bring out as you and I sit and chat for this hour today. Mr. Handy, let's go back to the beginning, if we might. I mentioned that you were born in Philadelphia. How much life of your, or how many years of your life were spent there?
Well, I think about 5. My father was an editor in Philadelphia and had ideas. He tried to promote in Philadelphia the idea of celebrating the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America. Philadelphia was, it said, not so progressive in those days, and Chicago was a very progressive city at the time, almost a frontier town in terms of that century. They were receptive to the idea and asked him to come out and promote the idea there. So we went to Chicago, and being 5 years old, I decided to go along with it, or concurred in the decision.
Concurred in the decision, your vote being one of some 7 children in the Handy family.
I was the youngest
right?
of 7 children, with 4 years between me and number 6.
Well, that's an interesting spread. I wonder if this at times gave some inspiration to your determination to make communications as simple as you seem to have been bent on.
Frankly, they talked, and I didn't know what they were talking about. It was, so I was given to understand, an educated family, and most of them were writers, all but one, helping to earn the family living in one way or another. And they talked a lot, and I didn't know what was going on up there. So I became much interested in the general subject of communication, especially from the receiving end.
As a matter of fact, I think I read where you had 2 sisters in particular who did a reasonable amount of experimenting with you as the subject on progressive education.
I think I was their laboratory, and they had differences in their ideas as to how learning should be done. The one sister was a disciple of Froebel, and she was going to kindergarten college as a spare tire in case that she had to earn her living in a different way, don't you know? The other was going to the Francis Parker School. Francis Parker School, its central idea, so far as I could see, was progressive education, allowing each student to go at his own pace. And the kindergarten idea was to, to let the learner have some fun out of it while learning.
And this I hope
so there was quite a lot of argument, and I was a guinea pig for them, yes.
Now then, let's get back to Dad for a moment, if we may. Your father's name was Moses Handy, isn't that right?
Moses P. Handy, yes.
He was a newspaper publisher, but had quite a reputation as an after-dinner speaker and toastmaster, didn't he?
Well, a newspaper editor, yes. And he was, socially minded. He had started the Clover Club in Philadelphia and was one of the originators of its successor, the Gridiron Club in Washington, where he had been the toastmaster and the griller, shall we say, or at least the master of ceremonies, he liked a good dinner, and he had to go to many banquets. So he would come home to have dinner with the family. He was a family man before he went to the banquet. And usually he would bring with him the guest of honor. That was particularly so in Chicago. And there we had as visitors many of the diplomats whom he had met in Washington when he was a Washington correspondent of the Chicago Tribune, and visitors who were in various activities, and particularly businessmen who had problems in those days. We were in the period of the first series of consolidations, those that on which J.P. Morgan was the spark plug, shall we say, or the catalyst. So they talked over their troubles, the troubles of communication and large organization, getting the people to understand why their businesses existed, why they had a job, how the job should be handled, why the invention, if it were an invention, had been made, how to get things working and how to keep them working, how to get understanding, in other words, and a training job done. So at a very early age I became interested in that, and the more so because I wasn't allowed to talk. Each of the children was allowed to ask questions.
I see.
The number 6 was allowed to ask 2 questions. I was allowed to ask only 1.
They were almost out of questions by the time they got down to you.
Right. But one question, even though I may have learned to make that leading question, like how did you make such a success, Mr. Carnegie, or how did you get along so well with in the development of your business, Mr. Armour? Even with tricky questions of that kind, I didn't learn all I wanted to.
Mr. Handy, speaking of your early education, I'm told that you finished both elementary school and high school in some 8 years. I think 5 in elementary and 3 in high school.
Yes, that's true. My progress was accelerated, well, first by the fact that I spent my first 3 years at the exposition. 1 year while it was being built, 1 year while it was open, and 1 year while they were tearing it down.
And of course, this is
looking at the exhibits.
World's Columbian Exposition,
That's
which
right.
finally came to be.
And I learned by looking and by reading the little captions under the exhibits, and that sort of thing.
I think your father agreed, as a matter of fact, that was a top-rate education in itself.
Well, he was committed. I had read some of his promotional material, and it said it was going to be an educational exhibit. And I said, well, why can't I get my education there? And I got first permission to go there for a year. I was just about to go to school, and then I managed to run it into 3 years. So I got into school and got a running start, and they were glad to get rid of me because I wanted to teach the teachers how they should teach. And teachers, don't always like that. At least they didn't.
No, I'm told they sometimes frown on it.
Well, particularly if it's coming from a 9-year-old.
Yes. Mr. Handy, let's come back to later education, when you attended the University of Michigan.
Well, I didn't attend for too long there. I had 2 ideas I tried to sell. One was the idea of democracy. I'd read and heard something about that as being the general policy in the United States. I didn't think that fraternities were democratic. So I organized with somebody else as a leader, did a bit of ghost writing for him, shall we say, a good popular student, to make a crusade against fraternities. So I became known as an agitator. Then I hadn't entirely overcome, by any means, my notions as to the improvement of the entertainment and the speed with which learning could be accomplished. An experiment was made by Professor Trueblood in dramatizing his lessons, acting out the situations which were described, either historically, he was fond of historical romances, or otherwise, allowing the students to participate in the learning process.